Okay, can I welcome you to this, the fourth of the Westminster faith debates, dealing with the question of welfare and faith and welfare. We've had a tremendous set of events, a lot of discussion, a lot of interest, and the purpose of these events is to allow the researchers who've been doing academic work over the last 5 years on the place of religion in our society, as part of the Religion and Society programme, which is led by my colleague, Professor Linda Woodhead, Professor at Lancaster University, for the researchers to present their research and then get a response from two leading public figures in the area in order to try and promote discussion about the substance and the findings that we have. The two researchers we're very fortunate with this evening, Sarah Johnsen and Adam Dinham, will be introduced in a moment by Linda, and I will introduce Archbishop Peter Smith and David Blunkett MP to respond at that appropriate point. I should say that this event is being videoed and it will appear on the Religion Society website in all its glory after this event. And so if for any reason you don't want to be on the video and to be videoed, you should not participate in the discussion from the floor. I can't think why you wouldn't want to, but if you're naturally shy and retiring and wouldn't feel that it was appropriate, please remember that it is being videoed. There are a number of thanks to give for this event. The first is to the two research councils, the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council, which have resourced the programme, a £12 million programme, out of the desire to try and ensure that we understand better than we did before what the position of religion is in our society, and they funded the whole programme. They're also funding these events. Secondly, the Politics, Philosophy and Religion School at Lancaster University, where Linda is a professor, and her colleagues Rebecca Catto and Peter have made this happen and work in an effective way. Thirdly, the Theos think tank, led by Elizabeth Hunter, who's here in the front, who's done a tremendous amount of work on making sure this operates in an effective way, which we really do appreciate. We've had a tremendous level of activity and commitment, a lot of publicity about the subjects in this series, which have run through identity, education, radicalism and the issues around that. And if you look on the Religion and Society website, www.religionandsociety.org, you will see both the substance of the past discussions and also there's a page now with all the media coverage there's been on these issues in a wide variety of different outlets. And if you're interested in the subjects that we've been discussing, there really is a rich mine of information there for you to follow up if you'd like to do so. I'm now going to move straight to introduce Professor Linda Woodhead. All the speakers will speak for 10 minutes. I have a vigorous signpost system, traffic light system, which I'm going to apply with unaccustomed rigour to make sure that everybody sticks to time and that we then can have enough time for people to contribute from the body of the meeting until 7 o'clock when we intend to end. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Linda Woodhead, who's directed the programme and who's the animating force behind it. Linda.
Thank you very much, Charles. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans. And in contrast to the hesitant government agencies, religious organisations mobilised quickly to provide heroic relief and pick up the pieces. The value of faith-based welfare was vividly displayed. Americans reacted to this in two ways. Some saw it as a vindication of President Bush's signature policy, the Faith-Based and Community Initiative. Its aim was to free religious groups from all restrictions in caring for those in need and secure for them a very large share of federal social welfare resources. But other people drew the opposite conclusion. Wasn't it this very shift from government which was to blame for the abysmal showing of the governmental agencies? And that's a debate that continues in the USA. I mention it because it throws into stark relief, starker than anything we have here in Europe, an ideological battle about state versus faith, or state versus civil society, or secular provision versus religious. And that's part of the backdrop of our discussion tonight. But note some big differences with the UK context. First, no one's really suggesting such a massive shift in favour of faith-based provision in the UK, although, as we'll hear, there has been a turn in this direction. Secondly, the American initiative had an ulterior political motive, which was to support evangelical Christians and win their votes. Provision in the US is mostly Christian. Here, in the UK, the ulterior political motive for the shift has been to produce greater social cohesion, and it was to involve all faiths, not just Christian. And that's augmented as well by a growing localism agenda. And a final difference, Bush's moves meant that religious groups were freed to do faith with a big F, to honour their distinctive values, to proselytise, to try and convert if they wanted, as for example in those evangelical schemes for rehabilitating prisoners and drug addicts, or even ensuring teenage chastity. We're a very long way away from that sort of freedom in the UK, where we like faith initiatives to be universal in provision and often as secular looking as possible, something else we'll hear about. So all that raises a few issues for our debate tonight. How much welfare should faith provide? How much should the F factor, the faith factor, be allowed? The row over Catholic adoption agencies was a controversial case of that. And what's really distinctive about faith-based provision? What does the F add? Just recently, there has been quite an explosion of research on this topic, quite a lot of it funded by European bodies, the EU as well. And a few emerging findings strike me as particularly interesting. In relation to the question about what's distinctive in faith-based provision, the answer is it all depends on the relation between state and religion in a particular nation-state setting. And that's a question about how they divided up welfare provision historically. And it varies widely across Europe. Southern Europe is very different from Northern Europe on that, for example. What this means in practice is that faith-based provision tends to plug the gaps in state provision, or to put it more positively, it's complementary to state provision, depending on what kind of state provision there is. And faith-based initiatives often identify new areas of need. They plug the gap in that sense as well. It's not just passive, it's quite active. Another finding, particularly in relation to the UK, is that state provision tends to deal with more acute needs, which may need deep intervention and which are so serious that professional training, expertise, tight regulation and accountability are needed. Some faith-based provision works in this area, but a great deal is less intensive than extensive. For example, sustaining relationships over time with lonely people, with the chronically ill, with people who need lifts to hospital or meals, with those working in the sex industry, dealing with the health needs of first-generation migrants, and so on. That's work which some have called quiet care or slow care. And another thing the research shows is it's massively gendered. Women are preponderant at the point of delivery, not necessarily in the management, but at the point of delivery. This chimes with another finding regarding the distinctive profile of faith-based provision in the UK, which is that there, if you like, there are two categories. There are large, resource-rich, professional charitable organisations like the Salvation Army, housing trusts, Jewish Care. And in fact, faith providers are predominant in housing associations and in homelessness provision, as we'll hear about. But there's a second, very different category of many, many small providers, often based around a place of worship, with volunteers doing a lot of this small-scale, quiet care work. And to give you an idea of the massive scale of this, there are roughly 54,000 places of worship in the UK, and some 80 to 90% are doing some sort of welfare work. And there are 24,000 registered religious charities which have a religious profile. That's 1 in 7 of all charities, including some of the largest and some very tiny ones, many tiny ones. Final point from the research, the landscape of faith-based provision has changed dramatically since the 80s in this country in a way which we're only really starting to get to grips with. We tend to think of it just still in terms of the mainline church's work. It's changed in several ways. Non-Christian religions have become big players. Some are very powerful in the local community. We heard about the role of the East London Mosque in an earlier debate. Near me, up in Preston, the Gujarat Hindu Centre plays a similar role, not just for their own members, but widely in the community. Complementary and alternative provision in the well-being and welfare and health sector is a huge growth area as well, which we also haven't paid enough attention to. There's obviously some shrinking in mainline church capacity, but there's also new emerging church initiatives. And of course, note the continuing provision of chaplaincy in prisons, in universities, and etc. And then also overall, partly as a result of the government taking faith activities and cohesion more seriously, since the 80s we've got many more interfaith initiatives and linking bodies like the Faith-Based Regeneration Network. One final thought. If you stand back a bit and you look historically at how organised, centralised welfare activity was laid down at national level, the big bursts of activity coincide with periods of movement and dislocation in societies, which caused exclusions that needed to be dealt with. So the first big phase was in the 1880s, when urbanisation was the great dislocator, creating new needs. The next phase was, of course, the 1940s, with war as the great dislocator, and then an attempt to establish just, peaceful, national welfare settlements. And now, just wonder whether now we are in a third phase of similar mobility and dislocation caused by things like global flows of capital and people. Things which offer many, many people great opportunities, but also have very high costs for some people, and breed new exclusions, new problems. But I wonder if the solutions can just be national this time. In any case, if I'm right about this first phase, getting the mix of provision, faith and state right, is more crucial than ever, and that's really our topic tonight. So, over to our speakers, and I'm delighted to introduce first Dr. Sarah Johnsen, who's had a project on the Religion and Society programme, and she is Senior Research Fellow in the Institute for Housing, Urban and Real Estate Research at the School of the Built Environment at Heriot-Watt University. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Linda. And hello, everybody. Faith-based organisations, or FBOs as they're commonly known, have always been key players in the provision of services for homeless people. Most of today's homelessness services are, or historically were, affiliated to religious bodies. My study, funded by the Religion and Society programme, explored what, if indeed any difference, the F in FBO makes to what is provided and to how it is provided. Ultimately, my colleagues and I wanted to know, if you're a homeless person using these services, do you, A, notice any difference between faith-based and secular services, and B, care? Do they prefer aspects of faith-based provision or secular provision, and if so, what? We visited secular and faith-based services, hostels, day centres, soup runs, and interviewed a total of 150 service managers, frontline staff, and homeless people. These individuals represented a spectrum of religious and non-religious identities: Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Hare Krishna, Sikh, agnostic, atheist, and all sorts of kind of deviations and variations thereof. Some services were small, run by volunteers and charitably funded. Others large, professionalised establishments supported, at least in part, by public money. Our findings indicate that the F in FBO is not as obvious as is typically assumed. They should also allay the fears of those who are suspicious of FBO's motives. A few years ago, the Commission on Integration and Cohesion noted that commissioners administering public funds often feel, I quote, squeamish about supporting FBOs, given anxieties that they might use taxpayers' money to promote religion or discriminate against certain groups. We found no foundation for such anxieties, in the homelessness sector at least. It is true that in the past, some FBOs did expect homeless people to sing for their supper by attending worship services or scriptural study, for example. Such practices have, however, been discontinued by virtually all. Support as regards spirituality is available and greatly valued by some users, but engagement with this is, with very few charitably funded exceptions, optional. Further, we found no evidence of FBOs excluding homeless people on grounds of metaphysical stance, religious identity, sexuality, or other such classification. Faith-based homelessness agencies, like their secular counterparts, aim to be very inclusive of service users. That said, there is a glass ceiling for staff without faith in some FBOs. No organisation involved in our study actually required frontline staff to profess a faith, but a few did require this of senior managers. This practice is lawful, but means that staff without faith cannot be promoted above a certain level. And some interviewees questioned the justifiability of this where agencies receive public funding. That issue aside, our research showed that faith-based homelessness services are not as different from their secular counterparts as is often presumed. Most contemporary secular services actually grew out of faith-based initiatives, and their values are strikingly similar. Furthermore, staff teams in both faith-based and secular agencies almost always contain a mix of people of faith and of no faith, and often from a range of different religious backgrounds. Recent years have witnessed a reduction in the visibility of religion in many FBOs for two reasons. First, a number of commissioners have placed restrictions on the expression of religion. Second, FBOs have, of their own accord, reduced their outward religiosity to avoid appearing unwelcoming to people of another or no faith. Consequently, many of the homeless people we spoke to told us that they find it difficult to discern systematic differences in the quality between faith-based and secular services. Most will tell you that there are no systematic differences in the quality of service provided or the legitimacy of care expressed by staff. In fact, there will often be disagreement amongst users as to whether or not a particular service is or is not religious, and if so, how religious it is. We found that some homeless people give overtly faith-based services a wide berth because they have had negative experiences of religion in the past. Others seek them out because they want to explore spiritual matters or the support of fellow believers. The majority, however, are actually relatively indifferent, as long as they can choose whether or not to participate in or talk about anything religious, which, as I've already noted, is almost always the case. The key thing defining homeless people's service preferences is, in fact, what organisations expect of them. There is at present a very vigorous debate within the homelessness sector regarding how interventionist services should be. And views on this fall along a spectrum. At one pole are non-interventionist agencies, which allow homeless people to be and do not require any commitment to change. Some homeless people will only use these types of services. The approach has, however, been deemed irresponsible by some commentators for allowing vulnerable people to continue in behaviours such as drug misuse, which are profoundly detrimental to their health and well-being. At the other pole are interventionist organisations who insist that service users engage with support that is provided to address their problems. Interventionist approaches can be very effective with some individuals, and they are being increasingly endorsed by central government. They have, however, been severely criticised by campaigning groups for excluding the hardest to reach and exacerbating their already very difficult circumstances. Contrary to what is often presumed, we found that it is the secular agencies which are most sympathetic toward interventionist rehabilitative approaches, with some notable exceptions. Faith-based agencies, on the other hand, tend to favour the non-interventionist, unconditional approaches. These are complex issues, based as they are on different weighting that individuals and agencies accord to welfare and liberty. They are also highly emotive, given the vulnerability of people affected and the potential for interventions to harm rather than, or as well as, help. FBOs are, and will continue to be, central to debates on these issues. Our research concluded, then, that faith-based homelessness services are not as different from their secular counterparts as is assumed, often. Some observers may consider this a good thing. It allays fears about proselytism, for example. But it also presents a profound challenge to FBOs. For, if their aim is to provide a qualitatively different service experience, and for the influence of their faith to be evident within that, it seems that many homeless people are not, in fact, noticing. Faith is a key factor calling many individuals to work with homeless people and sustaining them in what are often very difficult roles. Yet it seems that staff without faith are motivated and sustained by an equally strong urge to do something about homelessness. The motivational source may well be different, but the outward expression of their ethic of care is, in the eyes of many homeless people, much the same. Our research thus suggests that whilst the spiritual support provided by FBOs adds value, the distinctiveness of faith-based agencies should not be exaggerated, given a blurring of the boundaries between the religious and the secular. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Adam Dinham. Adam is Reader in Religion and Society. He's a qualified social worker, and he is currently Director of the Faiths and Civil Society Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London. Adam.
Thank you, Linda. I went into faith-based welfare work with the Church of England on leaving university, which was a bit of an eye-opener, which might be surprising. What that work convinced me was that this is a really vital part of national life and it deserved more attention. And this talk is based on various research projects I've led over the last 10 years since then. And more immediately, it's also provoked by a network funded by the Religion and Society programme in 2010 to 11, which brought together young people, in particular, of any faith and none, engaged in social action in local communities. And what that network made me realise was I stopped and reassessed my thinking on the future of faith and welfare in this country. Because these young people are, after all, the generation who will be taking that work forward in the future. And something really struck me about that network. And that was that today's young people appear to be nowhere near as binary about the secular and the religious as previous generations. They seem to see religion as normal. Their reaction to it is more aha than oh no. Now, I'll come back to why this matters for the future of faith-based welfare at the end. But first I'm going to try an analysis of how that domain has developed over the last 15 years and what issues this raises. And I begin with New Labour. Charles and David will be pleased to hear. It's not widely recognised just how much New Labour invested in the whole area of faith and welfare, both in terms of policy but also funding. And I undertook a research review for the Department of Communities in 2008, which found that Labour introduced 8 major national initiatives and 10 major funding streams which could be accessed by community-based faith groups, as well as 2 funding streams specifically for faith-based social action. And that report revealed 3 ways in which Labour valued faith. One, as repositories of resources, by which I mean staff, volunteers, networks, buildings and money. And 2, as active citizens, meaning that they volunteer more, they give to charity more, and they even vote more. And 3, as being good at community, and especially at generating social capital, which was important for integration. So that's the policy. In terms of funding streams, the biggest was the Faith Communities Capacity Building Fund in 2005 to 7, which distributed £5 million of government money to 338 faith-based social action initiatives and 238 interfaith projects. And what was striking was that there was a conscious attempt to ensure a distribution across traditions. So Christians received 17.3%, Muslims 16.9%, Hindus 13%, Sikhs 12%, Jews 10.8%, Buddhists 9.4%, Baha'i 7.3%, Jain 4.8%, Zoroastrian 3.3%, and a category called Others got 5%. These funding initiatives were mirrored with governance mechanisms designed to improve faith's participation in civil society. Now, the achievement here was rather more shaky. At national level, the Faith Communities Consultative Council was appointed to advise the Secretary of State for Communities. And though this caused considerable controversy amongst bodies like the National Secular Society and others, in fact, it only met twice. I think it's true to say that at government level, New Labour never quite worked out how to engage effectively with religions. But at regional and local level, there was, I think, much more success. Government introduced a local authority duty to consult faith communities in community planning, and places were allocated for faith participation on the regional assemblies. Faith groups were encouraged to take part in things like local strategic partnerships with great effect. And in research in 2006, of 112 faith organisations which were surveyed, 84 were part of their local strategic partnership. Another 71 were on a local strategic partnership subgroup. 9 were on a PCT board, and 10 were on a crime and disorder partnership. So they were really taking a part in these new forms of participative governance. In addition, generous funding for regional faith forums was made available in all 9 of the English administrative regions via the regional development agencies. And also notable was the setting up of the faith-based regeneration network, which Linda mentioned earlier. The Faith-Based Regeneration Network, for those that don't know, is an umbrella body which networks grassroots faith-based projects with each other first and with policymakers as well. And it's grown to become one of the most important coordinating initiatives in the whole faith and welfare area. In policy terms, all these New Labour initiatives cohered around a recognition and valuing of religious plurality, of multi-faith, and an enthusiasm for building good relations within, between and beyond different faith traditions, and this was very distinctive. So far, so good. What New Labour did was to realise the importance of faith for welfare and social cohesion, and that's a huge achievement in itself, set against a secular ideology surrounding welfare provision, which had, since the 1960s at least, either ignored or actively opposed the contribution of faith to the welfare landscape of this country. But before Charles and David get too happy, let me suggest some serious deficits as well. I've already mentioned the failure in effective engagement with religion at government level. Another fly in the ointment came along in the form of the Prevent strategy. This was targeted at preventing radicalisation by engaging at local level with Muslim communities and cut across what was being achieved elsewhere in, I think, 3 ways. First, it confused community cohesion with prevention of extremism. And this was bad for community work, and according to researchers at one of the previous Westminster faith debates, it was bad for counter-terrorism too. Second, by focusing solely on Muslims, it undermined the whole thrust of the multicultural, multi-faith approach, which had emphasised working together and forging links, not working separately and competitively. A final criticism is that in many cases it never really became a genuine partnership between faith and state. FBOs often felt they had to dance to local and national government's tune and found themselves dealing with cumbersome, sometimes compromising demands and regulations. So now to the current government's emerging approach to faith and welfare. Well, let me start with the positive. It's fully taken on board, this government, the importance of the faith contribution, and it also wants to deregulate and to leave faiths to do the work in which they're already expert. And all this, of course, fits with the whole idea of smaller state, bigger society. However, let's look more closely at what this means in practice. Above all, government funding is largely being withdrawn. 2 of the 9 regional faith fora are closed or dormant. The remaining 7 have made redundancies. The Faith-Based Regeneration Network is now in the final 2 years of what's being called tapered funding, after which it must be self-sufficient or close. Also, what the Coalition has done through the Near Neighbours programme is to select the Church of England as a favoured partner to lead the faith-based welfare contribution. To return to the perspective of the young people involved in faith work that I mentioned at the beginning, this is all highly problematic. This generation doesn't remember a national church. They've grown up in a context of religious plurality and multi-faith RE, in which belonging has given way to new kinds of believing, and in which they get their religion not from their parents and grandparents, but from the internet and from each other. They remember 9/11, 7/7, and the Arab Spring. They expect religious diversity. Making Church of England vicars into gatekeepers won't wash with their friends and peers of other faiths and none. I agree with them, and I also think that the state should shrink in relation to faith and welfare, but not disappear altogether. I think it's essential that it plays an enabling role, providing a framework which helps distribute power, wealth, and capacity round providers and service users of all faiths and none. And this is essential, apart from anything else, for cohesion in local areas and nationally. Umbrella bodies like the Faith-Based Regeneration Network are, I think, essential to achieving this. They keep the channels of communication open between grassroots projects and between them and policymakers in ways that nobody else can do. And they don't need much funding, but they do need some, and they add huge value. So to conclude, young people recognise a welfare economy which includes the full range of faith traditions, and policy, I think, should promote the participation of them all. Unlike previous generations, this one is, I think, baffled, both by any secular insistence that faith stay out of welfare and by the anachronistic idea that the Church of England should lead the charge. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree we've had, tremendous presentations from Linda, Sarah and Adam. Thank you very, very much indeed. It's given us a great basis for taking the discussion forward. I made a terrible omission at the beginning of the event, which is I'm under strict injunction to give you the details of the hashtag for all of those who wish to tweet out of this event. And I have my knuckles regularly rapped for not doing it as effectively as I should. And on this occasion, perhaps in some reaction, I completely forgot. And the hashtag is #WFD12. So if you want to tweet, please use that hashtag. Now, we've got two very leading public figures to respond to this research. And I'm delighted to begin by introducing Peter Smith, the Archbishop of Southwark. I first met Peter when he was Bishop of East Anglia and lived in Norwich when I was a Member of Parliament for Norwich South. And since when he's gone to be Bishop of Cardiff and now Archbishop of Southwark. All I can say really about Peter and all I want to convey to you is what an outstanding religious leader he is. He is a man who, in many, many conversations that I've had with him, is utterly committed to precisely the ambitions that we're talking about here of his church being able to help communities and work well with communities and engage with communities. Personally, he does that all the time himself in the way he operates. He was just saying beforehand he's finding it slightly more difficult dealing with the bureaucracy that he has to deal with. But he's a real model as an individual to talk to about the way in which faith organisations and big religious groups can make a difference to the welfare of our society. And it's a great honour, Peter, that you've agreed to come this evening. Thank you very much for doing so.
Well, I've been called a twit before now, but never a tweeter. So, first of all, I want to thank Sarah and Adam for their papers this evening based on their research, which I found very illuminating and accords very largely with my own experience of the involvement of religious or faith-based organisations and groups in the area of welfare for some of the most vulnerable members of our society. The contribution of religious charitable organisations in the United Kingdom is, of course, well documented, as we've heard, and was very publicly acknowledged when Pope Benedict and the Prime Minister met during the Pope's visit in 2010. A snapshot, if I could put it that way, study by our own Catholic Social Action Network last year showed that at least 800,000 people are being helped by charities and groups linked to the Catholic Church, ranging from small food banking projects staffed by volunteers to large-scale professional organisations such as Nugent Care up in the north or St Cuthbert's, which provides specialist service to thousands of the most vulnerable people in England and Wales. And research by the Church Urban Fund highlights the extent of social action work in Anglican parishes. Almost 20% have support in place for unemployed people, and over a quarter provide some form of help for those in debt. Nationally, the Children's Society works with about 48,000 vulnerable and disadvantaged children every year. And elsewhere in the Christian community, the work of denominations such as the Salvation Army is very widely known and highly respected, whilst the significant contribution of other faiths includes organisations such as Jewish Care, whose 70 centres support at least 7,000 people each week. And the Islamic communities also have a very, very strong charitable outreach, both at home and abroad. And that was very evident when I was Archbishop in Cardiff. We had a very good relationship with the Muslim Council of Wales, and the then First Minister, Rhodri Morgan, had established an interfaith forum where the church and religious leaders met with government twice a year to discuss matters of mutual interest, how we could help each other, and so on. But the Muslim community there had a great outreach in terms of welfare, both at home and abroad. And all this work, as Sarah found in her research, is inclusive, despite the popular perception often that it's discriminatory and inward-looking. People of all faiths and none work together and are supported across the spectrum without judgment or proselytization. Now, the social action contribution by religious organisations will inevitably become, I think, more important where state provision is withdrawn. Indeed, for many charities, an increased level of demand for their services is already evident, given the present economic situation and the cuts in government spending. And not only will people turn to faith-based groups, I think, and the wider third sector for support in tackling the immediate challenges of unemployment, debt, and financial hardship, but also the devastating secondary effects such as family breakdown, homelessness, alcohol abuse, and increasingly mental health issues will also arise in all too many cases. Now, importantly, religious charities do not just meet these needs through services such as care, shelter, training, or whatever. They're also valuable sources of advice for many people. Many service users, for example, here in London, use the Catholic Children's Society in Westminster. They come to its centres as their first port of call for guidance around benefit or housing issues. And they're not just Catholics that come. The word spreads, anyone is welcome there and will be treated absolutely equally. And such services, I think, will only become more important as the area of shrinking welfare continues to take hold. It's also worth touching on the role that religious organisations are playing in advocacy on behalf of the poor and vulnerable in this situation. Organisations such as our own Catholic Social Action Network, the Children's Society, Zacchaeus 2000 Trust have been prominent voices in Parliament and in public, calling for important safeguards as social security is restricted. And linked closely to this is the importance of challenging misconceptions around those reliant upon state or charitable support. The ever-present danger of the most vulnerable being made scapegoats in an age of austerity was underscored by recent testimony by 6 of the main disability charities to the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, that they are now regularly contacted by disabled people who've been taunted for supposedly faking their disability. It's not to say that there aren't some who do that, but it's too broad a brush at the moment. They express concern that in what is becoming a climate of suspicion, disabled people will face increasing hostility and even violence. And there's a clear role, even a responsibility for religious organisations to use their influence, networks and reach to educate and challenge this climate while supporting those who may be intimidated or abused. What of the challenges for the future? In the context of shrinking welfare, religious organisations are also facing significant challenges. As Adam highlighted in his paper, whilst the government has openly recognised the contribution of faith-based charities, key sources of funding have been simultaneously reduced. This, of course, comes against the backdrop of cuts faced by the charitable sector more broadly. The majority of our member charities receive some degree of public funding, and almost all are facing reductions, some of these with potentially serious impacts upon their services. And this presents genuine questions as to whether religious organisations, or indeed the third sector as a whole, will be able to meet the significant human need generated by the shrinking of the welfare state. Whilst churches and charities collectively support vast numbers of people, they will undoubtedly struggle to help the additional hundreds of thousands affected by legislation such as the Welfare Reform Act, and at the same time as their own resources are reduced, because most religious charities rely largely not on government funding, but on the contributions of people, within, say, the Catholic Church or the Church of England and so on. Amid competition for ever limited funds, the reluctance for some commissioners to fund faith-based organisations that Sarah touched upon may become even more pronounced, causing disproportionate damage to those charities with a religious ethos. Funding from donors has also been understandably affected as individuals' own fiscal tightening reduces their level of giving. Having said that, people are still extremely generous despite having to tighten their purse strings. So, in conclusion, in spite of these challenges, there's still a clear role for religious organisations in this era of shrinking welfare. Firstly, our churches, communities and charities should act to support people through the significant changes that they're facing. And of particular importance will be assistance for those cut off from their local support networks. This can be undertaken through both professional and informal service, with parishes and other religious communities especially well placed to provide the latter for newcomers to the area. Secondly, advocacy for the poor and vulnerable must remain a priority. Changing societal attitudes towards the unemployed, sick or disabled is an area where we can make a vital contribution through faith schools, youth groups and places of worship, as well as through established charitable organisations. And underscoring all of this should be a continuous reaffirming of inclusive, non-conditional service. Both funders and, more importantly, those we seek to help must be assured that the priority of religious charities and social action projects is not proselytization, but the care and support of the most vulnerable in society, in line with our understanding of our vocation to help those in need.
Peter, thank you very much. That was absolutely tremendous. It now gives me great pleasure for the second respondent to introduce an old friend, David Blunkett. I've known David since he was leader of Sheffield City Council and I was a member of Hackney Borough Council in the 1980s. And in that capacity, of course, David saw intimately the way that a local authority operates in relation to welfare provision. And more than that, was actually the national representative of the local authority associations dealing with social services in other areas. But then, of course, he came into government, came into Parliament, then into government, and as Secretary of State for Education, as Home Secretary and Secretary of State for Welfare, he absolutely was in government responsibilities which were at the core of this discussion. So, David, it's a real honour that you would come and join us tonight, and thank you for doing so. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your response to the research which has been presented this evening. David Blunkett.
Charles, thank you to you and Linda, and of course to Sarah, Adam and Peter. I'm at the tail end, so I'll try and make mine a little bit short and sharp and to the point. I mean, Alistair Campbell said we didn't do God, but we actually did. we did it like all the good things we did, with a degree of subtlety that nobody noticed. I'm reminded, Linda was talking about things going in phases and reflecting on the 1880s. Actually, I mean, Peter will put me right if I'm wrong, as the Archbishop who knows a lot more about this than I do. But all my reading of medieval England was that the monasteries actually were the embryo welfare state. They provided a roof over people's heads, they provided hospice, they provided shelter at times of conflict, and the erosion of that was in part the discrediting and therefore the counteraction that took place with the Reformation, in this country at least. And I think that what we're getting to now is a new accommodation. And the new accommodation recognises the critical role that faith has to play, partly because of what's been described this evening, 24,000 charities of different sizes. I didn't know the figure, but I knew it was very large. It's quite hard to get them all to work together, actually, even in a local community. I asked, when I was Home Secretary, Fiona McTaggart, who represents Slough, to try and get various faith bodies together so that we could see if we could have an overarching view. It was like herding cats. I think it took 3 meetings to get agreement on what they should be discussing. And it was difficult because people rightly have their own background, their own agenda. They want to remain and should remain independent. But if the contribution to the challenge of the future is going to be met, then it will be met by people being prepared to share and work together. And that, I think, is a really very big challenge. The regeneration network, as has been described, has only got limited funding for a very short period of time. The capacity building that I think Charles and I are very proud of in terms of government comes and goes, and at the moment it's going. And I take up the point that was being made earlier about the nature of the delivery of services. This issue around whether it's done unconditionally or whether it's carried through in a way that seeks to teach a man or woman to fish rather than to giving them the fish. And I think there's a real interesting challenge for faith groups to engage with that debate, because without it, we will end up just shouting from the outside as the present government either carefully configure the debate around, if you like, Aunt Sally's that don't really exist. You know, the ceiling on any family getting help was configured in such a way in order to create a debate. There is a genuine one in London about what it does to individual families, but it was undoubtedly a way of placing the debate on the government's terms. You may disagree with this, but I think that the reaction of the churches, and unfortunately Peter's not allowed in the House of Lords, but the configuration of the debate was very, very good, because people in the faith communities were speaking out, not just for the vulnerable, but for the values that underpin their faith. Secondly, the reason I think that faith is absolutely crucial to what we're discussing is because faith groups have something that is really vital to delivering any welfare provision and to helping people to help themselves, and that is premises. I mean, the provision of community facilities over the centuries has been built up, and alongside it, community leadership. And the reason why community leadership from faith is so important is about continuity. People will stick it out because of their faith in a way that even the most saintly of those in the secular field would find it hard to do. And there's no question about that people's faith actually is something that they can draw down on, literally, to keep them going, Peter, when things are very rough. Dealing with people who have got addiction or are on the street on a Friday and Saturday night, when more formalised services are on emergency only, and it's very difficult to get them out. And, you know, that's not a criticism of secular welfare services, it's just an observation of where people live and where they are. And faith leaders often do, not exclusively, but often do live in the place that they are serving in a way that our professional services don't. So the building, the leadership, the sticking power, the ability to be there. So I think another factor that I think I would draw attention to is the way in which, this is something new, by the way, groups have come together not just to deliver a particular service. Homelessness is an obvious one. The cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral in Sheffield, runs the Archer Project, which many of us are involved in the city, on homelessness, but actually also on the campaigns that Peter Smith, Archbishop Smith, mentioned, because actually being an advocate for people who don't otherwise have a voice is an important role for the church. And the Archbishop of Canterbury has been criticised very heavily from the political right in this country for daring to have a voice. I wish him well down at Magdalen College in Cambridge. His voice will be somewhat quietened. But it is a really important area of welfare, because people having a voice, being encouraged to have their voice heard, is a really critical part of a functioning civil society. I just want to take a very small measure of, not disagreement, but if you like, getting into the roots of what Adam was saying about New Labour. There's no doubt whatsoever that we didn't get the cohesion versus counter-terror entirely right. Not because we picked on a particular religion. I mean, the major threat, not the exclusive one, but the major threat at that time actually did emanate from a distortion of a particular faith. So you can't duck it. I mean, the IRA and the Continuity IRA arose from Ireland and caused people of Irish extraction in this country great hurt. But it was something that had to be understood and faced within their community, just as the Muslim community have faced that in Britain and were the victims of attack on the 7th of July, which Charles will remember vividly. So there are all sorts of strands here that we need to pull together, and confusing as we did cohesion with countering terror and trying to mobilise people within a faith community to help us was a mistake. But actually the endeavour of prevention was a good strand of the three, and we should have pursued it vigorously and separately, and I hope it doesn't disappear in what has been the rewrite of it. And finally, because I'm running out of time, I'm totally in favour of pluralism if it doesn't actually say, as a sort of new website, overtoyougov.com, because that's what we're in at the moment. It should be a partnership, it should be pluralistic, it should not frighten us to do that. When I went to Chicago and saw work in the most difficult areas, including training and placing people in work, there was a continuing fear in the United States because of proselytization, just about got that out, in a way that there isn't here. But that's partly because we do understand and have proper mechanisms for according what is a charity and what should be designated, and we've got used to it in terms of how we deal with schools. I just want to say this last thing. There's a school in my constituency called St. Catherine's, run by the Catholic Church. Its outward work from the school itself with families, its interfaith work, its advocacy work, and its understanding of citizenship that it is teaching those youngsters in a primary school is quite remarkable, with a remarkable head teacher who's deeply committed. And I think those sort of examples are the root of prevention in a functioning welfare state, so that we're literally, as someone coined last year but seems to have forgotten, we're all in this together. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Well, I think we've had an absolutely excellent set of presentations, and I'd like to thank all of you for that. We've now got just over half an hour of contribution from the floor. I'm going to take them in threes, if I may. I'm going to try and do what I've not always succeeded in doing, in getting a fair balance between women and men. So can I ask particularly the women among you to think hard what you'd like to raise? And after I have a three, then I'll come back to the platform for comment and observation on the particular issue. So can I firstly see indications for the first round of three? I see the woman over there, the gentleman at the back, and the gentleman in the green jumper here. There's people with mics going around. So can you just identify yourself briefly, please?
My name's Claire O'Brien, and I'm a teacher, a religious studies teacher in South London. And I just wanted to know if the panel share my concern about the coalition government deregulating FBOs, because I think that there's an assumption, a flawed assumption that we make in society, that faith is enough to provide care for the most vulnerable people in our society, when actually dealing with these people sometimes needs rigorous training. And I would never deny that amazing works that many FBOs have done, but it would also be naive to deny the abuses that this can be open to, particularly in Ireland, 1940s, 50s, the Roman Catholic Church's provision for unmarried mothers. And I think that most people know that abuse that these women received was widely documented.
Okay, deregulation of FBOs at the back there.
My name is Andrew Copson from the British Humanist Association. I've got about 20 or 30 comments or questions, so I'm going to just try and choose
I'll limit you to one if you don't mind.
Okay,
I'm sure
one.
you'll understand, in the interest of rationality.
It's completely balanced discussion. My question goes back to the very beginning, and I'm just asking this question about state-funded faith-based organisation provided services, okay? So there was, the point was made at the beginning in the first presentation that certain jobs could be reserved for people with particular religions above a particular level. And although there have been a number now of lower level employment tribunals that have, which faith-based organisations have lost, where they have discriminated against, i.e. either other Christians who aren't the right sort of Christian or other people who don't have the belief of them. It's never gone any higher, and so no proper precedents have been established. Do you agree, though, that when, or don't you agree, that when public services are being provided by religious organisations with state money on behalf of the state, those employment exemptions that otherwise apply when faith groups are operating under their own auspices shouldn't apply? And if, as you say, religious organisations operating in that way are not taking advantage of the other exemptions they have from equality law, like the ability to proselytise and to discriminate in service provision, why do you think they lobby for those exemptions to be there if they're not using them?
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Gentleman there.
Hello, I'm Stephen Nischel, former Assistant Chief Probation Officer. I was very interested in hearing about faith-based organisations tending or having a tendency not to have specific requirements of achievement or change for people, and other welfare organisations often do. In my role as Assistant Chief Probation Officer about 5 years ago, I went to talk about Salvation Army about undertaking some work for the probation service. This is the beginning of the commissioning process. And what the Salvation Army, who I've got a great respect for, said was very interesting about the whole process. First, they said, well, we probably wouldn't do it very well because we're actually not used to working to other people's targets. Secondly, if we did pick it up, sort of work for the probation service, we would be alienating some of our funders. And thirdly, National Offender Management Services messed us and other charitable organisations around rotten in the process of communication, to obtain a bit of funding. What does the panel think about how that tension should be managed, statutory funding going to faith-based organisations under those sort of circumstances?
Thank you. Three absolutely excellent questions. I'm going to go to Sarah, then to Peter, then to Adam, then David. Sarah first.
Okay, on the issue of why it is faith-based organisations don't lobby for exemptions in terms of proselytism and discrimination and so on, it would genuinely kind of go against the ethos to in any way discriminate against anyone.
So that wasn't my question. My question is they do lobby for them, but then practically they don't use it.
In practice, they don't.
Andrew, just let Sarah finish the answer.
In practice, it wouldn't fit with their ethos. So in practice, it's not happening. As regards the issue about employment and the requirement amongst some, and again, it was a very small minority of organisations, I must emphasise, in my study that required senior staff to have to share the faith of that particular organisation. I spoke to commissioners about this. Some of them hadn't actually been aware of this practice until I alerted them to it, and their view very much on that issue was, I could see why people would have a problem with that. But their response was, actually, what are we here to do? We are here to fund high-quality services for very vulnerable people. We need them to not discriminate. We need them to not proselytise. Are the organisations actually doing that? Yes. If they're doing that, they were saying, actually, we're not so concerned about the actual recruitment practices. As long as what the homeless person on the ground is experiencing, they were less concerned with that. I agree there is a fundamental kind of ethical issue about that, and perhaps something that we could debate further.
Thank you, Sarah. Peter.
Well, as far as the first question is concerned, I'm not sure I quite understood it, but I think you were saying, you know, that very often in the past the staff at these places were not properly trained. Well, I fully agree with that. It's much, much more professional now, because I think certainly the Catholic Church has understood much better the need, apart from which, yes, there have been abuses in the past, and that shouldn't have happened. It did, and it shames us all. And we don't want any more of it for the future. As to the second one about discrimination and having restrictions, I mean, the only way I would put that is, for example, in our Catholic schools, we have the right to restrict the headship to a practising Roman Catholic. Now, that's important for the ethos of the school. You've got to have, you know, good leadership, somebody who understands the faith and lives it, because the head teacher's job is absolutely vital in any school. And I think that's it's not unjust discrimination. It's making a proper judgment that that is necessary if the school or, say, the nursing home is going to continue with that Catholic ethos. The third point...
Stephen was talking about dealing with the Salvation Army when he was acting.
Oh, yes, yes. I think the thing, from a point of view of faith, what we have to do is say, well, this is what we do. If undue pressure is put on, then we either have to argue, well, we would argue our case, we're quite used to that, or withdraw. I mean, if what is demanded goes against what I firmly believe, both from my reason and my faith, if it's going to compromise my integrity, I can't do it. And that's often where the conflict comes.
Thank you, Peter. Adam.
Yes, thanks. I'll just pick up, if I may, on the question that Claire asked about deregulation. I'd just say that faith-based organisations providing welfare services are subject, of course, to the same criteria of public services as anybody else, and quite rightly so. You mentioned abuse, and you're right to raise that. And of course, it's a very sad and tragic thing when abuse happens in any public service. But of course, it's also sad and true that abuse happens in secular settings too. So neither of these things, I think, are problems that are distinctive to faith-based settings.
Thank you. David.
I think it's been answered, but I just say we actually, do we not, perhaps you don't, but I do, kind of expect in the back of the recesses of my mind more of those who proclaim their faith and are driven by their faith than I do from other people. So I think that's, Peter, why people were so upset, because it wasn't that this hasn't happened elsewhere, Lord above, it did. Regrettably, it was almost like a virus. It's just that it's a bit like, I mean, this is a real hostage to fortune. People expect Labour MPs to be more moral than Tories.
That is a hostage to fortune, yeah. David, and interesting. Can we have a separate discussion on that question? It'll be fascinating. Thank you, David. Next round of three. Woman over there, gentleman there, and gentleman there. So, woman over there.
Hello, my name is Christina Dykes, and I work for Dominic Grieve, who's one of the first speakers at another meeting. I have a question about the Near Neighbours scheme. The implication was given that this money was being funneled through the Church of England for some sort of advantage of the Church of England, whereas I understand the involvement of the Church of England is primarily as an administrative process, using its national networks and resources, and that broadly other faiths were appreciative of this. So isn't it better, I put to the panel, that money is administered through a faith-based organisation that is sympathetic to the sector than through the state, which involves, dare I say, all the sins of increased regulation, control and remoteness?
Thank you, Christina. Gentleman there.
My name is Nick Spencer. I'm Research Director at Theos. I'd like to thank the panel for all their presentations. I have a specific question with regard to conditionality. I was fascinated by what you said about conditionality, and I wanted to know whether your research gave any indication of why faith-based organisations were less likely to be conditional, meaning were they driven by some sort of theological motive that their provision should be free and limitless and for theological reasons, or were they simply terrified of being accused of proselytising? And the attendant question on that, which I realise is a much, much bigger one and in some ways an unanswerable one, what does the evidence suggest about whether conditionality or unconditionality is more successful in treating hard cases in the long term?
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Arnold Ratcliffe, World Dialogue Council. Just firstly to say how enormously valuable the collection of data is upon the question of what the contribution of charities and religious bodies is in the faith-based sector. I know from the international context that there's a huge gulf still to be filled in that arena, and I've worked with the World Faith Development Dialogue and CIFA, the Centre for Interfaith Action in Washington, looking at that, and that just suggests that future research could explore that further, because the value of hard data is inestimable in this sphere. Secondly, I just wanted to look at two sides of one coin, really. One would be to say, what sort of dangers might lurk for the position of religion in society if faith-based organizations are perceived to have value only in relation to their general social benefit? Is there a hazard there, or is that simply something we need not worry about? And the other would be to press the question of what the specificity is of the faith contribution. We've heard a specific reference to perseverance as something that could be brought to mind, but that's an interesting question to my mind. Where might we go in looking at that harder? And very quickly, just our humanist brother, I would just make the point that the Church of England's never been funded by the state, and I stress that, but we have explored the boundaries of having bishops who are agnostic. I would suggest Bishop Holloway comes to mind, a wonderful intellect, but whether he was still specifically Christian, I would leave for him to think.
Perhaps taking us outside the narrow terms of reference to this discussion. I'm going to take the response from the platform in reverse order, so David first.
I'm not sure that the Church of England haven't actually explicitly, but that's because we tended to fund monuments in the past, didn't we? So you get a grant for keeping the building up. Anyway, it's just a thought. On the first question, I think we mustn't fall into the trap of believing that there is a model, one which is flexible and non-bureaucratic and reliable, and one that isn't. I think that my experience has been that in the public services run through and funded by government, you can run into the most terrible bureaucracies, and you can also have the most imaginative and innovative programs. And in some charities, not many I've come across, you've had the most incompetent people who didn't really know what they were doing and wasted other people's money and time, which brings me on to conditionality. I don't have the evidence here tonight about whether conditionality works. All I know is that when you grow your children, when you nurture them, you provide them with a framework by which to live. You don't just say, well, you did Summerhill School, just get on with it, go and do what you like. But most of us don't. We actually try and teach a framework by which to live, even if we fall short of it ourselves. And in working with, supporting and helping other people, we have some idea in our heads, don't we, as to what it is we're trying to do to help that person to help themselves, because otherwise it is a patronising handout.
Thank you. Adam.
Yes, thanks. On the near neighbours question, I think there are, you're right that it's the administrative function, but I think there are two things. One, it's mistaken, I think, to understand the parish system as having the same kind of resonance and relevance. after 10 years of a multi-faith paradigm and the reality of religious plurality that we now have in Britain. Things have changed a lot since the last time the Church of England could claim to be a national church. And I think practically as well, parishes are, some of them, many of them, rather more hollow than they once were in terms of the resources that they've got. And that means the number of vicars, the condition of their buildings, the amount of money that's being spent on maintaining heritage buildings and paying clergy pensions. So I don't think they're quite as full structures as they might seem. The second thing, and I think this is much more important, is there's no evidence yet, no significant evidence anyway, there's anecdotal, on how multi-faith bodies are responding to near neighbours. I know some work's being done on this. But I think that this model poses a risk to the multi-faith paradigm that the previous administration invested so much in, and so did local communities and the regions too. And that risk is that the model that's being posed is one in which people from other faith traditions are being expected to literally queue up for the Anglican vicar's signature for their grant applications. And some may well be relaxed about that, but it's not clear whether they all will be. So that's that question. On the question about dangers for religion in society if faith-based organisations become valued only as useful for what they can contribute, I think it's a very important question, and I think the implications of that are that what's distinctive about the faith-based offer, potentially, is that it broadens the canvas of concerns. And there's never been a more pertinent moment, perhaps, than now, the last couple of years, to ask questions about alternative logics to those of markets and the way in which society extends and augments a view of almost everything being geared towards those. So I think there's a role there for that, and the faith contribution, I think, hangs around that. On the question of conditionality, this was Nick, wasn't it? I think it's really blunt, actually, to talk about conditionality in very simple terms. It can be a very blunt tool. There are some faith-based services which actually need to be conditional on, for example, being single faith, because otherwise service users, there's a whole tranche of service users that simply won't use them. So I think policy has to be quite nuanced around this, and charity law and charitable policy particularly, there's some evidence that there's awareness of this and it's moving towards a greater sensitivity about this. But for example, there are certain women's groups in some faith traditions that simply won't access a service in particular areas. What do we say to them? No service available to you? Or do we get a bit more nuanced about the way we make policy about that?
Thank you. Peter.
No, all right. I don't think it matters, well, it wouldn't matter to me much, the Church of England is administering the funds. All I would ask for anybody who's doing, whether it's government or a charity, is to be fair-minded and make sure, that the funds are spread proportionately according to who's applying for them. Now, on the conditionality, good gracious, that's quite a complicated question. I think, again, it comes back to the question of integrity, doesn't it? Take the Catholic Children's Societies and adoption. We objected to being forced to do something which really went against our conscience, the teaching of the Church. As a consequence, because the government wouldn't give way on that and give us an exemption, which seems to me at the time, and still does, which was perfectly reasonable, because there are about 480-odd adoption societies in England and Wales, and there was only 13 of us in the whole of the United Kingdom. So nobody would have been disadvantaged, in fact, had we got that exemption. So there comes a point where I would have to say, as an individual, I can't do this. I'm sorry, but it goes deeply against my integrity and my conscience, in fact, for me, for the teaching of the Church. But it's a difficult one. Again, it all depends what you mean by discrimination. We have always said, as Catholic Church, unjust discrimination is wrong. But I think many people forget the root of the word discrimination. It's from the Latin discrimen, which means to make a judgment. And in fact, we make judgments every day. I can make a judgment which side of bed I'm getting out of. It's not. There's not just one blanket thing as well because you're not providing this for that group or the other. That is not necessarily unjust discrimination. The third one now was.
It's the place of the dangers of faith-based.
Yes. I suppose the danger is that the churches or religious organisations become a sort of another secular social service. Now, I think the key there is the motivation for it. If somebody were to ask me, well, why do you look after the poor and the vulnerable, I would say, well, that's part of my faith. That's part of the teachings of Christ. It's the second great commandment. You must love your neighbour as yourself. With no discrimination. The good Lord didn't discriminate, after all. And there's that great passage at the end of St. Matthew's Gospel, the Last Judgment, when the good are commended. And they say, well, why are you commending us? When did we see you hungry, thirsty, or in prison, sick? And he said, as long as you did it to the least of one of these, you did it to me. And that's our motivation as Christians for caring for the poor, the sick, the vulnerable, and so on.
Thank you. Sarah.
Why is it that faith-based organisations tend to err more towards these more unconditional, non-interventionist services? And is it something to do with the ethos, was the question. The answer is yes, absolutely yes. Non-interventionist organisations would say that they are, in making the service open to anyone, regardless of whether or not they're engaging with the support, is valuing their dignity, valuing their wealth, their worth as an individual, and that is very much in accordance with their faith. However, the non-interventionists, many of whom, secular organisations and so on, would say they are advocating more interventionist ways of dealing with homelessness for the very same reasons. There might not be the faith motive, but actually it's because they're valuing them as an individual and valuing them so much that actually they will do whatever it takes in order to assist someone off the street to address a drug addiction and so on. If someone is in a very, very compromised position in terms of their health, they've got Hep C, they're rough sleeping, they have abscesses from hypodermic needle use and so on, they will say it's because we value that person that we will do whatever it takes and we will use coercive measures if necessary. The difference between the interventionists and the non-interventionists are the trade-offs that they're willing to make in terms of liberty and welfare, and the degree of risk that they're willing to accept that the outcomes might be undesired outcomes, for example, people disengaging with support. Do we know whether or not conditional services work? What evidence is there on that, particularly as regards their effectiveness in the long term? Well, we do know from some research, some of which I've conducted myself, that quite enforcement-driven initiatives can work with some people some of the time. For example, the use of, to give an extreme example, an antisocial behaviour order with someone who was involved in begging. We do know that sometimes that can act as the motivation to prompt someone to engage with services, deal with addiction, go inside if they're rough sleeping and so on. For others, the outcomes can be quite devastating, drives the problem underground and so on. We do know that you can't predict for whom kind of more coercive or enforcement strategies more likely to work. What we don't know is why. Why is it that it works for some people some of the time? And so, this is a key thread running through all of these debates. And fundamentally, we don't know enough about the nature of addiction, particularly for people at the very extreme end of kind of social exclusion and so on. And we don't know why it is that some supportive interventions work sometimes and others don't. I just want to pick up on something else, partly in relation to the conversations we've already had, but also in relation to some of the things that have been picked up on in the media as regards this particular event. I want to say something in defence of secular commissioners, actually. And I want to say that the squeamishness I talked about is not without historical foundation. I found no evidence of any form of discrimination whatsoever, and Peter Smith and so on has talked about that also. But FBOs did, in the past, actually require some homeless people to participate in religious practices. These have discontinued, and perceptions amongst commissioners have not evolved in concert with changes in faith-based organisations' practice. But but I don't think we should condemn them for holding these views that actually weren't so inaccurate so very long ago. What I would hope is that this event and the other kind of ongoing activities of the Religion and Society programme will challenge those outdated perceptions so that views become more in line with what's actually happening on the ground today, and I hope that could be a really constructive and positive thing. And I also want to note very briefly, if I may, say that contrary to what was implied in a Telegraph report today, I've never actually said that my study provides evidence that of anti-religious prejudice in the homeless sector, and certainly not that any such feelings were directed more towards Christian organisations than those affiliated with any other faiths. I very deliberately never used the term prejudice in any of the outputs from my study. Did I find evidence of squeamishness? Yes. Anxiety, nervousness, perhaps even suspicion about faith-based organisations' motives? Yes, all of these things. Did I find evidence of out-and-out prejudice? No. I do think that some secular organisations might be nervous about funding FBOs. They might place restrictions on their expression of religion and so on, but they are actually funding faith-based organisations in the homelessness sector. Many of them have got very, very long-standing, very positive relationships with organisations in the sector. And I just wanted to make that quite clear.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, we've got a lot of people want to come in, so I'm going to take a round of 6 now, and then before asking the platform to respond. Lady at the back in the blue-green shirt, the lady in front of her, gentleman there, then I'm going to go the other side, gentleman back there, gentleman there in the blue jumper, gentleman at the front here, so right at the back.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm far more sceptical than the panel seems to be about this.
Can you just identify yourself,
Sorry,
please?
Dee Burkett, I'm a journalist, and in this context, a mum. I'm far more sceptical about your kind of notion that we're in some sort of Milky Way of mush of us, of young people all just don't really care what faith we have and everyone gets on. I have 2 children who have just been fighting as many people to get into secondary school, and let me tell you, faith is absolutely determined. So when the bishop talks about he would like to have the Catholic head, what isn't mentioned then, of course, it's not what the faith of the head is, it's the faith of what all the children have to be. And I think all of this we can't really talk about until when we have a faith-based education system where I am about half the schools that my children can apply to, they cannot apply to as secondary schools because they are not of a certain faith. Half the schools, they are shut. Now, I'm not arguing against faith-based schools. What I'm arguing against is schools that discriminate against pupils because they don't have a certain faith.
Okay, that's helpful. Just to say, we have had a session 2 ago on education specifically, at which these issues, they overlap, I understand, but I don't want to go down a full education discussion. I want to keep with welfare if I can. The lady there.
Alison Gelder from Housing Justice. We're a kind of umbrella organisation for Christian homelessness activity. And 2 things. One is the research that I've been part of really backs up what Sarah's been saying, except for one point. We did a small study with Heathrop College, which involved focus groups with clients, guests at winter shelters. And we found that the services that were offered in churches, very closely linked to the church building, were perceived as Christian and being offered by God and perceived in a very spiritual sense, in contrast to services that may have been offered in other venues, but by faith-based organisations. But the front line that I find myself on is not about the squeamishness of commissioners to commission faith-based organisations, but about the squeamishness of commissioners to work with non-commissioned services. And I'm really struggling to get the voice of non-commissioned services heard alongside commissioned services. And as the welfare straight and withdrawals and cuts happens, I think that's something that commissioning organisations are really going to have to face. And I don't know if the panel have got any views on that.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over there.
Barry Evans. I come from Peckham in South London, and we've got a real problem with the ageing Afro-Caribbean population, the women isolated very often in situations. So the very elderly, the 85 plus age group, and the church is struggling to support even its church members in that group, because the breakdown in the Afro-Caribbean society of wider support of children and grandchildren and so on that they would have expected in Jamaica or wherever. And I just worry about, with decreasing funding, with the pressures on faith-based organisations, not so much the funded commissioned support, but the support that's much more informal within faith-based organisations, and the needs are going to grow and the funding's going to decrease.
Thank you. Gentleman just there in the blue jumper. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dan Northam-Jones. I'm very interested. I was actually part of the Heathrop study there. I coordinate a homeless shelter on Saturday nights. I'm interested in the way that doing social action impacts upon the worship life of a church. Sarah, your piece of work is entitled The Difference That Faith Makes, presumably to homeless provision. I'm interested in panel's views on the way that the difference that social action makes, or engagement with homeless makes, to worship.
I've forgot my fifth person. I've got the sixth. The fifth was there, quite right. Beg your pardon.
Yeah, my name's John Higgs, and I work for a grant-making trust. I'm a funder, and I spend my working day visiting FBOs, whether they're faith-founded or faith-focused. And I've been doing this for many years, and I just wanted you to know, from what happens on the ground, that I rarely see, I can't even remember the last time, I got an application disguised as a vehicle for proselytization. What I see in all the applications is individual FBOs trying to bring services to their beneficiaries, who are all faiths and none, the churched and the unchurched. And this business of proselytization is about as old as the Salvation Army spikes that you have referred to earlier.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Dr. Ramsey, Education of Muslim Council of Britain. I would like to say thank you for the interesting presentation. God bless you all. As an imam, I have a faith-based question for the Right Honourable David Blunkett and, of course, Archbishop Peter Smith. If you have been in position where you were given the job of bringing back faith to the street of Britain, what would you do?
Thank you.
And of course,
I'll take one more from Elizabeth. Just here, please. Thank you.
Hi, Elizabeth Hunter, Director of Theos. I'm interested that all the way through the presentations and the questions, we've been using this word proselytization and proselytizing as if we all know exactly what we're talking about. I don't think you'd find that many religious people who would use that word about a part of their life in general. So I'd like to know, when commissioners think about avoiding proselytizing, what are they specifically thinking of? Where are the lines? Can you put sacred text verses on the walls? Can you leave pamphlets around? And from the position of faith-based organisations, how are they thinking of it? There's a common phrase, preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. So for a lot of them, it's very hard to differentiate between the action that they're undertaking and the witness to their faith. I'd be interested in that.
Thank you. I'm going to take Peter, then Sarah, then David, then Adam. Because we had 7 questions, I'm going to say it's not necessary to answer every question for each of you. Peter.
Well, we'll be here all night. Just the first question about Catholic schools, or faith schools. Certainly in Catholic schools, pupils are not, or prospective pupils, are never discriminated against or rejected because they're not Catholics. The problem we have with our schools is that they're terribly oversubscribed by the Catholic community. And given that we also pay a degree of money to keep those schools going, that's what they're for. Anyway, that's very quick. I'll skip the housing justice one, Alison, if I may, for a moment. As to ethnic, elderly ethnic groups in Peckham, it is becoming a real problem. If we've got an elderly population now right across the country. There are more older people than young. And that's where I think the government does have to step in, because those communities can't actually look after themselves as one would want. Yes, the proselytism, and then I'll come back to the imam, if I may. How long is a piece of string, basically? What do you mean by it? What I would describe as proselytism is trying to force my faith down somebody else's throat. The good Lord never did that. He offered his message and said, there it is. I'm not forcing you. God doesn't force. He's given us freedom. He's given us freedom of choice, freedom of conscience. So it's proselytism would be trying to really wrongly persuade people by some sort of moral force to accept what I believe, and that's wrong. The best way of, and this is where I come back to the holy imam, how do we bring about faith to Britain? We have to, all of those who have a religious faith have to live that faith. I always remember Pope Paul VI, this is back in 1975, he wrote a letter called Evangelium Nunciandi, which being translated means, announcing the good news. And it's a beautiful letter. I still refer to it even after all these years, because he begins, after the preface and all the rest of it, he says, well, what's the first way we proclaim the good news? How do we, in that sense, evangelize? Bring the good news. He said it's by the witness of our lives. If we live out our faith and care for others, and in other words, it's clear that we worship God in our churches, in mosques or wherever, but the second great commandment, love your neighbour as yourself. And that is the thing which I find over a lifetime now at it, not doing it always very well. That's what convinces people. I can talk till I'm blue in the face. What they want to see from me is, do you live out your faith with integrity?
Thank you very much, Peter. Sarah?
Me already. Forgive me if I can't read my notes and get myself in a tangle. On the issue of proselytism, and what is it? Commissioners, well, certainly the commissioners I spoke to, would perceive it to be anything which forces homeless people to participate in religious practices, such as prayer, worship, scriptural study and so on, making them listen or forcing them to engage in any kind of conversation about religion, forcing religion down their throats, what's often referred to as, Bible bashing, and to use a colloquial term. That's what they perceive proselytism to be. Service providers don't use the term, generally. They talk about evangelism, communicating their faith, sharing their faith, phrases such as that. Some within that would very much see evangelism as something that doesn't involve words. It's a form of service. There are many people who are more theologically grounded who would be able to explain all the kind of reasons and rationale behind that, but there isn't actually any sort of talk of religion or any attempt to convert people within that. It is very much an act of service. Others are much more open about their faith, and again I'm talking about the non-commissioned services here, and this kind of manifests itself in various ways. Some will give their volunteers license to talk about their faith. Generally these conversations are prompted by kind of homeless service users themselves. Some agencies will encourage their volunteers to raise the issue and see whether or not homeless people will engage with it. But there are very, very different ways of expressing that, and again I must emphasise this tends to be the non-commissioned services. The question about does social action make a difference to worship? The answer is I don't know. I would be really, really intrigued to find out, actually. I've not done any study in this myself, but if anyone does find the answer, please do let me know. Alison's question about, or comment about the fact that non-commissioned and commissioned services aren't necessarily communicating with one another to the extent they might. I think a lot of that relates to this discord I was mentioning earlier between interventionist and non-interventionist approaches. There is, whilst sometimes the reasoning behind people's approaches is quite similar in terms of how they view the service users, there is a fundamental conflict between that, and that is creating a huge barrier, I think, for conversations about this. And this is where I think, you know, organisations like Housing Justice are doing a fantastic job in trying to facilitate the construction of bridges in this capacity. And also what organisations like Housing Justice do is they try and find a way through what Chris Baker talks about, blurred encounters between the kind of secular public sphere and the faith sphere, where sometimes they're using different language, they're not really understanding one another, sometimes they're using the same language but meaning quite different things, and this can lead to a lot of miscommunication. So what, again, a lot of sort of umbrella bodies and so on are doing is attempting to find a way through that, and I'm hoping that my research will assist with that.
Thank you very much, Sarah. David?
Very, very briefly, I can't really better Peter Smith's answer to the Imam, but just to say, and it links it to Elizabeth's question as well, when he's proselytising, not evangelising, and vice versa, the church army, the Anglican Church Army, have their headquarters in Sheffield. They go out on a Friday and Saturday night along the university bars and restaurants, and they hand out bottles of water and flip-flops, actually, because they told me that girls tend to lose their shoes for some reason. And so they're just doing good on the ground. They're not actually talking to people about religion, but they're demonstrating it. And I think you can draw a line where people are being approached. There was a GP, wasn't there, who was taken to task for actually intervening and trying to win somebody over to their faith, to their particular view, whilst treating them, and that clearly crosses the line. So I mean, it's a sort of grey line which we're struggling with all the time. On commissioning, on the wider issue of commissioning, I think there's a really interesting point here, because commissioning means a contract, really. It means that you're getting something for delivery, and those organisations that are raising their own funds or have been reliant on grants from foundations or what have you are outside often the policy making as well as the process of getting the commissioning together. I wrote a little pamphlet about 2 years ago called Mutual Action, Common Purpose, which was about how we're getting this badly wrong. We think we're doing the right thing on these big prime contracts, and they're not good, and they squeeze out niche organisations, and that includes faith organisations that are delivering something that a commission service can't deliver. Just very quickly on the first question, actually I didn't take you up on this, Adam, but I don't think that young people are getting their faith from the internet. I don't, honestly. I think they're still getting it from those immediately around them and the influences of their early life. And yes, there is a problem with secondary schools, not with primary, because I think your primary schools are in the most disadvantaged areas and have actually reached out into the community. You may have a shortage of places for the Catholic community, but they are a bit exclusive, and Charles and I did, both of us having done education, we did struggle with this, and I came to the conclusion, and I'm sure Charles did, was that having watched Napoleon and then Hitler, we weren't going to open a Russian front up with the churches, so you got away with it.
I roughly recall that conversation. Adam.
Thank you. David's made me want some faith-based flip-flops now. Just to respond to what David said about the question was about a mush of not caring about faith amongst young people. I think it might be bits of both, actually, because there is some evidence emerging now on intra-generational transmission, particularly around Sikhism, but I'll set that to one side. To focus on two questions that particularly struck me. One which was on the relationship between faith-based social action and worship. And I did some work on this a couple of years ago, which showed that what you can't assume is a continuity or a linearity of relationship between the worshipping community, the clergy or equivalent, the laity or equivalent, volunteers and services and projects that are done in the name of a faith-based organisation. They're actually much messier and more complicated than that. And very often what the faith-based social action project does may have almost nothing to do with the people that turn up on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday to worship. They may not meet most of those people. But the other question I was struck by was on proselytisation. And I want to say something fairly general about this, which I think the proselytisation debate springs from a generalised anxiety about religion in the public sphere. And I think it reflects a muddle and an anxiety because we've lost the ability to talk well about religion in this country, and that's after decades of relativist RE and an ethos of secularist assumptions. I know that's a contested phrase, but we find ourselves alongside that increasingly in encounter with religious plurality and less able actually to converse well about that plurality. So a natural reaction, I think, has been to try to push religion out of the public sphere and just to maintain a nice neutral space. And of course, neutrality isn't possible. Nobody starts from nowhere. There's no such thing as neutrality. And for my part, my personal view is that I think that faith-based social action should absolutely describe itself very clearly in religious terms, if it wants to. I think it's very helpful for it to do that, so that service users and partners and funders and others can hold them to account on those terms, can get very clearly what's the flavour of this service, and do I want it or don't I?
Adam, thank you. I have to apologise for having gone more than 10 minutes over time, which I do apologise. My mitigation is I think we've had a really fantastic session. I think both the original presentations and responses, then excellent questions from a wide range of different people, and excellent responses as well. So I really want, first of all, just to say thank you to all of you and to the panel for making this what I think has been a fantastic discussion this evening. Thank you very much indeed.